Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And we are beginning to link the Normandy campaign to the wider battle for France. We will be talking about Paris and Brittany later this month. But right now, Don Fox returns to World War II TV to share the history of 4th Armored's Breakout, so Cobra and the period beyond. So if you're new to the channel, welcome aboard. All the information you need is in the description below. You'll find links to my guests' books, their websites, and all the resources you need, etc., etc. But I'll bring him in now. So, good afternoon, Don. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Paul. It's good to be with you again.
So we were just chatting before going live about that gap between kind of Normandy and the Ardennes that is actually really, really interesting, but kind of gets overlooked because it doesn't necessarily have that big battle that kind of everyone's heard of. It's river crossings, it's taking chunks of France, it's getting towards Germany. But I'm sure you're going to agree, it's an era that should be understood better and studied more.
Yeah, absolutely. And there were so many great lessons for future generals and planners. When you look at the role of logistics, the art of exploitation, the campaign in 1944, it was exercised really to an unprecedented degree. Yeah, I would say on a level in contrast and even better than, let's say, Germany's initial invasion of France and the Low Countries, because it was done so opportunistically, and it really deserves a lot of attention and study.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've talked before about the Battle of the Bulge. Some of the decisive armored actions and penetrations and recovery operations there, the lessons had been learned. Maybe not in Normandy. Normandy helped in the lesson learning, but it's that kind of September, October, November period where combined arms are getting better and better. Mostly, we're on a forward trajectory now, but so it's a really interesting time. So, folks, we'll do questions as we kind of go along about specific details Don's going to cover. Any kind of broader questions you have about doctrine or something, we'll kind of do them at the end. But I'm going to hand over to Don now to take us through the 4th and what they did kind of after this time 80 years ago and beyond. So over to you, sir.
Terrific. Well, thanks. And yeah, the period I'm going to cover is from the 4th Armored Division's arrival in France in mid-July and up to the point that they reached the Moselle, and we can perhaps go beyond that, but a lot of my prepared material will be up to the Moselle. So I want to start, though, with a little bit of background about the 4th, because the success that they had was really generated by, in large part, two things. One, their commander, Major General John S. Wood. I'll talk more about him in a moment. But the other, critically, was the fact that the 4th had a longer period of training than any other armored division in the U.S. Army, fully 3 years. So they stood out in that regard, and training was just absolutely critical. When we start talking about the campaign in Normandy, with the Breakout in particular, many of the veterans talked about that as though they were on maneuvers. They were so prepared in a great condition to go forward. They even though they were under fire for the first time, they treated it as though they were, in many respects, like they were still on maneuvers. So a few bit of facts about it. The division was activated April 15th, 1941. Pine Camp, New York. Brigadier General Henry Wells Baird, later Major General, was the initial commander, and he led the division for its first year. And I think he often doesn't get enough credit. He retired from the military. He basically aged out when Wood took over, but he did a lot of foundational work with the 4th before Wood's arrival. Wood was outstanding. He had served in France, 3rd Infantry Division, or 3rd Division, they weren't calling them infantry divisions then, during the First War, remained in active service all the way through 20s and 30s. Specialist in artillery, was a very early advocate of mobility, and did that with his artillery command. Had taken some of his one of his units virtually cross country in the U.S. was unheard of at the time. So the division did its initial training in Pine Camp, moved on to California, into the Desert Training Center. One of the great ironies I've always thought about the U.S. Army and their training is that the only divisions to fight in the desert were the only ones not to train at the Desert Training Center.
Army logic there for you, Don. Yep.
Credit Patton for setting up the training center out there. The 4th had a few months out there. Actually did something also that was, as far as I know, unprecedented at the time in their training, and this was at Wood's direction. When they were doing their armor training in the desert, they actually used live rounds with their 30 caliber machine guns to fire at each other. So they were obviously stayed buttoned up in their tanks. But that was unheard of, and it really helped condition soldiers during their training. Of course, during that period, they were training as a heavy division. Some of your viewers may be familiar with that. The 2nd Armored, the 3rd Armored retained that heavy designation with 2 armored regiments and 1 armored infantry regiment. The 4th was among the first to be reorganized into a light armored division, basically 3 tank battalions, 3 armored infantry battalions, 3 armored field artillery battalions. Those are the core elements of the division. They spent time at Camp Bowie, then moved up to New York to ship out for France, boarded right at the end of the year, arrived in France, in England in early January. And then it was on the 9th of July, they began boarding for France.
Just a quick question for you that came in from Roderick. Were they shipping armored units around the USA by rail?
Yes. Yeah. So when they moved out to California, on to Camp Bowie, and then up to Miles Standish at the end, was all by rail. And one thing that was I always found very interesting too, it makes complete sense, is that when they went overseas, it was about an 11-day trip overseas, they didn't bring any equipment. So all the equipment was already staged, and it was not the equipment they trained with. And to their disappointment, they had some older Shermans, and I can't remember the exact models. It was not the M4A3 at the time, which was the preferred. So I guess the M4A1. I might be wrong on that, but not the preferred type, not a newer type that they had actually trained with when they were still back in the States. And that was a measure of disappointment for them. So, for example, they were back to some of the models with the single hatch on the turret, which they weren't too fond of. They preferred the dual hatches on the top. So the commander and the gunner had their separate hatches. So they get to England. They continue to train January through to their departure in July.
Where were they in the UK? We had the question from.
They were near Salisbury. So
Yeah.
they did all their training on Salisbury Plain and Devise, I think. And I'm going to apologize in advance for any butchered pronunciations, especially
Devises, I think you mean.
Yes.
Yeah,
especially when I get to French villages and towns, I apologize in advance.
No worries at all. But I mean, the thing is about Salisbury is it's still that area now. There are still roads the public take where there are a special Department of Road signs that have a picture of a tank crossing, because tanks can still cross over the road in front of your little your Ford car. So
it's interesting that you say that, because recently I was looking at some Google Earth images, going back and clearly seeing the landscape still being used for active fire. So fascinating after all these years to come in so well, being used so well for that purpose. In fact, just to take a step back, on D-Day itself, the 4th was actually out on Salisbury Plain. It was tough to get time because there were so limited areas to train. So it was coveted when they could actually get time on the ranges. And on very short notice, they happened to, on June 6th, were out there very early morning, and they knew the invasion was on when they saw a lot of the aircraft returning. A lot of the planes with the tow cables for gliders and coming back, and some actually seeing some battle damage on the planes, and they celebrated it at the time. Gave it a lot of hoopla while they were out in the field, and they were eager. I would never say everyone was. When you're dealing with 11,000 men, you're going to have a lot of different sentiments, but by and large, eager to get into the mix. So their time came over a month later. They start debarking primarily at Utah, but also small contingents at Omaha I always found that interesting. Some of it by mistake, a beach mass being brought to the wrong beach. In one case, 5 Shermans, they were accompanied by the exec officer of the 37th Tank Battalion, Major Bouts. Their craft commander, the LST, took them to Omaha by mistake, and the beachmaster would not let them off, and they had to go back out into the channel, make their way back to Utah. Were completely separated from the rest of the unit. It took them about 3 days to finally catch up with them in bivouac. And it took, by the way, with the force coming in, again, primarily at Utah, 3 full days to get the whole division over unloaded. And you can see on the map, and I don't know if you can see my cursor moving.
No, we can't see cursors.
Okay, so you probably can't see that.
Describe,
so,
yeah.
So you can see on the image on the left, most of the unit came in at Utah and then shifted over, assembled over on the far west side of the peninsula, behind the lines of the 79th Infantry Division. They were holding the front to the south of there, and on the right, the fonts are a little bit small, so people probably can't make that out. But I've noted the general assembly areas, bivouac areas for the primary battalions of the division. So really over a fair, good chunk of square miles. They weren't there for long. It was on July 16th that they actually received their orders to move into the line. And this was a bit controversial, at least within the command of the 4th Armored, certainly for General Wood. He understood fundamentally the way armor should be used, and primarily for exploitation, getting into the rear of the enemy, creating havoc, making deep penetrations. His first instruction was to use his 3 armored infantry battalions to relieve the 4th Infantry Division, which was in the line just north of the town of Raids. Between the front line at that point was between Santini, again, probably mispronouncing it, to the north, and Raids, small towns to the south behind that. A lot of marsh bordering that area to the west. You can sort of see that represented a little bit in the map image. Wood was furious. Bradley had first consulted with Patton. Patton hadn't taken command yet, but he was on the continent. It was understood that he was going to, in fact, it was a matter of just a few days later, he was given oversight, let's say, of 8 Corps, not technically command of it. Middleton still had it, but knowing that it was going to convert to 3rd Army, Patton was given let's just say, a very strong dotted line role over what was happening. So Bradley had gone to Patton originally to check with him. I wouldn't say get his permission, but at least get him to sign off on using the 4th Armored Division infantry, the armored infantry, to replace the 4th Infantry Division. When Wood was notified of it, he was furious. To think that after 3 years of training for a certain role, that the first thing they were going to be asked to do was to go into a static role. I've always had mixed feelings about this myself. I understood Wood's point of view, but at that point, the 4th Infantry Division was pretty well beat up. You know, they had not taken heavy casualties, fairly light casualties, really, in the D-Day landing, but suffered a bit more heavily during the action up the peninsula, moving towards Cherbourg, but suffered very strong heavy casualties when they went into the line west of St. Lo. And they were about worn out at that point, needed to be relieved. And despite the massive buildup of Allied forces in Normandy at that point, 6 weeks into the campaign, there wasn't a spare infantry division there to be inserted in that perhaps hadn't suffered almost equally. So the 4th was called on to do it, and did, but again, with a lot of protest on the part of it. And the thing that angered Wood the most was perhaps rather than explaining it as black and white as I did, Bradley stated to Wood that he thought it would be wise to blood the division, quote, blood it. And that, maybe more than anything else, infuriated Wood.
Because that implies that they're not good. Yeah, that's. I mean, I'm interested, Don, because this is the area I'm writing about right now. I'm covering the 79th and 8th Corps. That's what my next book is going to be on. And so I'm intrigued as when the 4th were in place up on the West Coast, kind of north of Lessay and south of Port-Bail. Did they have any kind of dealings with, for example, the 813th Tank Destroyer or the 106th Cavalry? Because they were the guys pushing down there, doing all sorts of inventive things in terms of dealing with bocage and marshes and bridges and high ground and ridges. And, that's exactly what I'm kind of researching right now. So did the 4th kind of have any observers who were kind of getting to grips with how the Americans are dealing with the countryside that Normandy consisted of?
Yeah, not to my knowledge, even though there is one terrific story with the 4th Armored about a lesson learned before they got into the line. And this came from, at the time, Major Albin F. Erzik. Al, I got to know him very well from, I first met him in 1999. He was a key figure in my first book. Spent countless hours with him, became a great friend. He lived to 101. So he had passed away in 2019. But in any event, Al wrote about this in his own biographical work. While in Normandy, he took some time out through the countryside, just doing some exploring, and he came upon this one section of the bocage where he at first saw a Panther tank that had been knocked out. And then he noticed across the field 5 Shermans, all knocked out. They had not been retrieved off the field yet. And he went over to the Panther and climbed up aboard it, and was just looking, trying to measure up. It became pretty clear that this Panther was probably involved in the knockout of these 5 Shermans. And 5 Shermans were grouped, by his estimation, grouped far too close together. Almost with no depth between them, like the literal ducks in a row. And he observed that the penetrations on those tanks were all in the stars. And he concluded that the gunner of the Panther had obviously intentionally just targeted the stars on each of those Shermans. And so his lesson, he walked away from it, was he ordered with his battalion commander, went and said, "Hey, we need to black out all the stars on the tanks." And if you look at photos from the period, you'll notice 2 things unique about the 8th Tank Battalion: no stars and heavy use of foliage. Dead giveaways when you're looking at photos from the 4th on whether it was a tank from the 8th Tank Battalion, the 35th, or the 37th. So that one poignant lesson learned, at least by Al, before they went into the line.
Cool story. Thank you.
Yep. Now, when they move into the line on the 17th, the 3 armored infantry battalions, or the 10th, the 51st, and the 53rd, and it was the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion took the main part of the line from the 8th Infantry Regiment of the 4th Infantry Division. There were, I think, 2 companies of the 51st went in. The 10th Armored Infantry Battalion was in reserve. And they go into the line, take over the positions on the 4th. In fact, the book that I have coming out, which is in October, which is a collaboration with a veteran of the 53rd, Sergeant Paul Porter, who later won the DSC, talked about how when they were coming into the line, they were, the members of the 4th Armored, they were just completely filled with carrying all their equipment, backpacks, everything. They had every piece of kit that they had. And as the men of the 4th Infantry were coming off the line, who now they're going opposite directions, and the men of the 8th Infantry Regiment looking pretty worse for wear, they would almost laugh at the armored infantrymen coming into the line because of them carrying all this equipment up and saying, "You are going to be losing all that, or lose it before you get up there." And that was a lesson pretty quickly learned. The need to travel light and well, it was learned within a matter of 24 hours, because when they get into the line, they are attacked actually the next day by the 2nd SS Panzer Division. And it was almost a rout. There was no supporting armor. Those 3 armored infantry battalions were under the command of Combat Command B, but it was, other than artillery support, it was just the armored infantry battalions. 2nd SS, skilled fighters, well equipped at that juncture, and broke the American line. Much of the 53rd broke and retreated. There was an attempt, and Paul Porter, who I mentioned, was there for this. There was an attempt by one of his company, Commander Company B, to actually surrender the company, and the Germans wouldn't take them, in essence. So it was a bad state of affairs. The 10th Armored Infantry Battalion, was pulled out of reserve and was able to come up and restore the line. The 2nd SS had recovered some ground, but the 10th stabilized the line. And then the next day, actually on the 19th, then launched a limited attack to try to restore the line back to its original place. And they did so with some success. They advanced as far as the town of Raids, but at that point, the leading company, commanded by Captain John Layton, got a bit out ahead of his supporting units on the flanks and got into a very heavy fight in Raids. He took a round to the stomach, was seriously wounded. Volunteered, if you will, to stay in position to help call in support, some supporting mortar fire, ordered his men to retreat. They weren't able to get him out. Some medics tried to come in and get him. It was I've always found this fascinating as you go back and you look through, read through battalion after action reports, diaries, etc. The loss of any man in combat carries its own level of tragedy, but there are clearly some that sting more than others, depending on, I'll just call it on the merits, depending on their strength of character or the role they played in the unit, the level of respect that they had. And Captain Layton was one of those, a man like that. They weren't actually able to confirm his death until, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, until later after the start of Operation Cobra, and when the 4th advanced back through the town of Raids and then actually recovered his body. And it was days later, but they write about that in the battalion journal, and what a sad day that was for everybody in the battalion. All right, so that heaviest fighting for them took place after they took the line from the 4th. From the 18th, 19th, 20th, things calmed down a bit after that for the 20th, 21st, 22nd. So let's move ahead to actually the 4th story begins on the 28th, but of course the 25th is the start of Operation Cobra. I'll discount the failed bombing the day before, but what most people look at is the official start on July 25th. The 4th at that point was holding its same position. It was going to be pinched out of the line by the divisions operating on both sides. So I believe it was the 83rd and the 90th, if I'm recalling correctly. So they were then pinched out of the line as 8th Corps started to advance. But one thing to recognize about the original Cobra plan was 8th Corps really wasn't intended to have a strong role in that. It's all going to be about 7th Corps, and primarily with the armored spearheads of the 3rd Armored Division and the 2nd Armored Division. The 3rd Armored Division was operating on the American right, or to the west, and their primary objective after the bombardment, after the infantry made the initial push, then 3rd Armored's objective was Coutances. Again, probably mispronouncing it.
Coutances.
Coutances. There we go. Giving it my very American treatment. I should be ashamed. So that was their objective. Whereas the 2nd Armored Division, operating to the 3rd's left, was supposed to penetrate deeper, farther south, more on a trajectory towards Avranches. When it became clear on the well, let me back up. The 3rd Armored, in particular, was stalled a bit. And the one thing, and anybody that has an affinity for the 3rd Armored will probably hate me for saying this, but the 3rd Armored had one of the more troubled histories, especially early on. In fact, the 3rd Armored had the highest casualty rate of any of the armored divisions. More tanks lost, and I think and I can't believe I'm forgetting the name of the book written by the armored, the maintenance guy.
Not the Belton Cooper one.
Yes, the Belton. Yes.
Oh, we don't mention that here.
Yes. No wonder. Selective memory loss on my end too.
Yeah, it's awful. Yeah, I forgot this good either. Terrible.
But one thing that a lot of people don't realize is, and this is maybe to some extent why Belton Cooper got some of the impressions that he did, was because the 3rd Armored struggled so mightily.
Death traps. Yeah. That's right.
And a lot of it was just it was command. It was the way they were deployed. Maybe some of their training, and they made up for it later times. I think later on, certainly after General Rose wasn't in command. I don't believe at the outset. So there were changes there, and they redeemed themselves a bit later on, but in this early stage, they had a heck of a time. Well, they were behind in their timetable to make it to Coutances. So as 8th Corps started to move forward, then the 4th Armored, the 6th Armored was committed, and the 4th Armored beat. They were very proud of this, by the way, in their division record, that they beat the 3rd Armored on the race to Coutances.
And it is interesting, Don, just to kind of be devil's advocate, because the route 7th Corps took is a worse route. It's much more up and down. It's undulating valleys. It's smaller roads. It's little choke points over bridges. The route south, kind of going south from kind of Perrier straight towards Coutances, is the better route, really. And you can see that when you can kind of drive 6th Armored's advance kind of in real time going for it. It does help as well when the German division in front of you basically bugger off as well, and there was a certain amount of buggering off of Das Reich and other units in the 2nd and 3rd, but in front of 8th Corps, they really did just do a run of the Germans. So it was, but it's a fascinating period. That whole last week of July is when as you're saying, the things that the Allies expected the Germans to do, they didn't, and the bits where they thought would be easy weren't, and the bits they thought would be tough were easy, and it's a fascinating period.
Yes. And while the 4th did not have the level of opposition in front of it that the 2nd, the 3rd Armored did, it still wasn't without resistance. And as I get into that, because I think there's misperceptions too on the ease of the advance, and particularly since the 4th Armored got so far out ahead of its trailing infantry divisions, and as I'll talk in a moment about the 6th Armored Division, you still had substantive German units to the west of the 4th axis of advance, that then as they were making their way down to Avranches with a column going out, because they're basically two routes to go down, and they even merge at some points. Those were being cut across. In fact, at one point, the forward command post of the German 7th Army, it's pretty well known, actually made their way through the column of the 4th Armored to get away. Choosing to go through gaps. So with a lot of retreat, but at the same time, the German forces also deciding to make a stand, especially when we get to Avranches. So when the as the Fourth moved into Coutances, one of the main things that they ran into there was extraordinarily heavy mines. Many photos were taken in Coutances. In fact, a couple days later, one of the a more senior member of the Fourth Armored from the Combat Command Reserve, Stork, was killed. Colonel Stork, by a mine when his peep ran over it. Being an armored guy, World War II. I never say Jeep. I always say peep. Some people say, "What are you talking about?" All the armored guys, whenever I said Jeep, they scolded me. It's a peep. It's not a Jeep. So anyway, I digress. So on the map, at the bottom of the map, you see all the red arrows. That's all the route of Combat Command B, commanded by Brigadier General Dager. And as they made that advance, again, you had German forces cutting across the lines. There's the town of, again, I'm going to mispronounce it, Sartilly, Sarthilly, a little bit northwest of Avranches. When the 486th anti-aircraft unit was coming through there, actually, it was at night, and a pretty heavily armed German unit came into the town, trying to make its escape. Had a very heavy firefight that the 486 was did extremely well in. But when they get just to the doorstep of Avranches, you see it's all the red arrows. That's all Combat Command B. And at that point, General Dager primarily did two things. He sent the 8th Tank Battalion to the east. You can see that one arrow going off, and there was a bridge on the Say or the Sea River there that they wanted to secure about 5 miles to the east. And then he took one tank company from the 8th, A Company, and had it go a little bit to the west to oversee. There's a big open area. It's on the north bank of the river there, and to guard that entranceway into Avranches, while the armored infantry and elements of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion and the 25th Cav were preparing to make their way into Avranches proper. And this photo that's here, this is actually from A Company. Try to make a long story short. They undercame fire from the heights that you see in that photo, and that's towards Avranches, just to the west of the town. And the Germans still occupied the heights there and had 88s there. In fact, the day before that, they'd sent Panzerfaust teams in to do some work on that American position. The tanks actually bugged out. This is the day before this photo was taken. They had to be ordered back to their positions. So even the 4th, as well trained as they weren't without their fears and nervousness in combat. And in fact, one problem that developed is when they bugged out of that position, in that interval between then and the time they got back, it opened the door for more retreating German forces to make their way into Avranches. And there was some very, very heavy fighting there. At one point, a column of about 50 vehicles, German vehicles, which at first, under the ruse of Red Cross signs, medical signs, tried to sneak their way through, and they were discovered and then came under fire. So the Germans actually organized and made a pretty strong effort to try to cut the road from the west. The 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion, which had suffered so poorly back in the Bocage, actually redeemed itself a bit there, and one sergeant, Whitson, actually posthumously was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for staying at his 30 cal, and almost it might be saying single-handedly would be going too far. He had the support of his platoon around him, but he was credited more than anybody else with holding off that German advance, killing some 50 Germans in the rout, destroying dozens of vehicles until he was killed at his gun. The blue arrows that you see, that's when Combat Command A was committed, and the 37th Tank Battalion famously came into the line for the first time. later General Creighton Abrams, Abrams being the commander of the 37th, and one of the, actually at the time, a platoon tank commander, medium tank commander, Jimmy Leach. He was a lieutenant, first lieutenant at the time, later became Captain Leach, commanded B Company up through after a period after the Battle of the Bulge before he went back to the States. The 37th broke through, including Leach's platoon, and secured all of the bridges that were necessary, Pontevalt and a number of others that were required. It got them all before the Germans could blow them. And being bold and going out there, and again, it was not in the absence of opposition to go do this, but they exploited it, captured those bridges, and that more than anything else allowed for the very, very quick release of American troops through the Avranches bottleneck, if it was what it would have been had they not secured that. So once they're through the Avranches corridor, the mission of the 4th, the first assignment was Rennes. And Combat Command A in the blue on the map had the primary responsibility. And Combat Command B, Dagger's command, then came on their actually advanced behind them. And originally, they were going to go straight to Rennes, but when they approached some suburbs north of it, they came across very heavy opposition. A couple of batteries of 88s were mounted for ground fire, caught the advancing column. The 35th Tank Battalion, and this is one of their tanks in the photo that was knocked out in that position by those 88s. They lost several tanks. 8, if I recall correctly. They got stung pretty badly, and it was very shortly thereafter, that same day, that General Wood had stated that this is not going to be a job for armor. This is going to be an infantry job to actually move into the city. And the 13th Regiment of the 8th Infantry Division was then attached. And the 8th Infantry was given the task of securing Rennes. But the 4th, as would be the proper application of armor, was given the task of encircling the town. And it was a grand sweeping arc, as you can see in the map. In fact, then CCB came in the red and made an even broader outer encirclement. And Wood, at this point, he had his eyes fully set on advancing east. So it was not in his original instructions, but he turned CCB in particular to Chateaubriand, well to the east of Rennes, and even beyond that, maybe about another 6-7 miles with recon patrols out beyond there, because he was ready to head east, and got into a lot of trouble for it. So Patton, and this is the irony of Patton. I always have some mixed sentiment on Patton. I give him praise where praise is due, but where criticism is deserved, he should be criticized. Patton was not on board with all of a sudden making a race for it. He followed the pre-invasion plan, subscribed to it, which was going to be to secure the Brittany ports. And all of 8th Corps was directed to do that. The 4th Armored should have been going at best just straight to Lorient. The 6th Armored was headed to Brest. There was no call to at all turn east. And when Bradley became aware that the 4th was heading east, that Patton knew about it. Patton was incensed, sent Middleton to go catch up with Wood, actually by motor, to go find him, to tell him that he had to turn around and head back. And it was August 4th that occurred. And I want to read this. Your viewers are probably familiar with Sir Basil Little Hart and his book, his final book. It was published right after his death, with History of the Second World War. It's quite a volume. I was 12 years old when it was published, and I always had an interest in this period. So of course, when the first thing I do as a youth, I look for the chapter that's dealing with Normandy and Breakout and so on. And I go to this page, and it's number 557. I want to read it. Readers may be able to get to, because this is in a footnote, and this footnote from Sir Basil Little Hart ignited my interest in the Fourth, but it speaks to this period and what happened. So it says, the breakout at Avranches was made by the U.S. 4th Armored Division under John S. Wood. I had spent 2 days with him shortly before the invasion, and he'd impressed me as being more conscious of the possibilities of deep exploitation and the importance of speed than anyone else. Even Patton had then, in discussion with me, echoed the prevailing view at the top that the Allied forces must go back to 1918 methods and could not repeat the kind of deep and swift armored drives that the Germans, especially Guderian and Rommel, had carried out in 1940. Now, telling me later what happened after the breakout, Wood said, quote, there was no conception of far-reaching directions for armor in the minds of our top people, nor of supplying such thrusts. I was still under the First Army, and it could not react fast enough. Interestingly, as a side note, he was under Third Army at that point, but I guess he didn't want to throw Patton under the bus too bad. Said when it did react, its orders consisted of sending its 2 flank armor divisions back 180 degrees away from the main enemy to engage in siege operations against Lorient and Brest. August 4th was that black day. I protested long, loud, and violently, and pushed my tank columns into Chateaubriand without orders, and my armored cavalry to the outskirts of Angers and along the Loire, ready to advance east on Chartres. I could have been there in the enemy vitals in 2 days, but no, we were forced to adhere to the original plan with the only armor available and ready to cut the enemy to pieces. It was one of the colossally stupid decisions of the war.
Wow. I mean, that's an amazing story, Don, isn't it? It's particularly because, as you said there, Patton is actually the one wanting to kind of play it by the rules at this point, when he is generally considered the rule breaker and the hell for leather, let's go for it. But it's what we talked about at the top of the show. This period is when the idea of how to use armor is sort of changing almost day to day, almost hour to hour, because there just isn't really the doctrine for the size of armored forces on the Allied side in this kind of environment. Everywhere they've been used previously, of course, they're in Italy, of course, they're in North Africa, but the amount of stuff, and particularly the support stuff, the artillery that's following, is unprecedented at this point. So there is no gameplay to go back to. This is kind of writing the history as you go along, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And you mentioned a great thing, and this is why Wood, of course, artillery was his specialty, and this was I don't know that the Fourth was the first to deploy it, but they had to leapfrog they were advancing so fast they leapfrogged the armored the field artillery battalions. So one would go into firing position, the other 2 would keep moving. Then they get a certain distance. Once they're out of artillery range, the last one pulls up stakes and moves up, and they keep leapfrogging one after the other to try to keep the spearheads with artillery support. So again, just not part of the normal experience for them. And here when they're turned west, and you can see the dramatic nature of it. First, they go to Vannes and then to Lorient. Again, CCB, having advanced all the way to Chateaubriand, has a long way to go. They go to Redon and then have to actually navigate back over the road net, quite a bit convoluted to get there. When they get outside of Lorient, it then becomes just like the advance to Rennes, except much more so at Lorient. They are as an armored division. They are not equipped to lay siege to this fortress port town, and so they set up positions outside of it. Came under very heavy bombardment in some cases. In fact, at Pont Scorff, again, may mispronounce it here. That's a photo at the time in a field where there were significant casualties because actually there was a German observer in a tree overlooking that field, and elements of Combat Command B had set up. There were a couple of battalion forward command posts there. And it was a devastating day for them, all from artillery fire. They commemorate that at that site every year at Point Scruff. In fact, recently some of the citizens from that village have been in touch with me and working on, have been things that they're doing well with the 8th right around the corner here. We're just, I think it was August 7th was the day of that. So it's tremendous. I've noticed in my travels to Europe, the 3 times that I've been there on research, it's amazing to me how the local populations are so grateful and continue to commemorate these events all these years later. A lot of my fellow American countrymen could take a great lesson from it.
Yep, here. Thank you.
Yep. So they contain these ports, and then finally, then are allowed to move on. One of the moves that's not talked about a lot, I had a few paragraphs in my book, and actually have done research later to supplement this, which I'll need to write about in another work, was going to Nantes along near the mouth of the Loire. And the 5th Infantry Division had contained that town up to that point. So this I always found interesting too. Again, going back to the 4th being held back. So you peel back one of your most exploitive divisions, but you're actually let an infantry division go ahead and advance farther, deeper than they were. It made no sense. So
we talk about the flawed plans of some things like Market Garden, but the whole is coming up in the sidebar. The whole Allied plan to go and either seal off or take over to use the Brittany ports. It's if you explain it, it kind of makes sense until you spend 2 minutes examining it, and then it falls apart very quickly as to what the hell the whole plan was all about. But by this point, supplies are coming into Normandy. They've got the Mulberries, they've got the things. And even if they'd got those ports in working order, which was by no guarantee, because Cherbourg, the Germans had famously, damaged. So the whole point of why they need to get Brittany, except to eliminate the German forces defending the ports, that I can get on board with very quickly. Yeah. But the whole port strategy I find very, very confusing. I don't know what you think.
And it all stems back to the original Overlord plan, which was this very methodical approach across France.
Yeah,
almost like, in fact, there's a great in Crusade for Europe, Eisenhower's memoir. There's a great map in there that shows the phase lines.
Yep.
Marches methodically going across. And maybe under that scenario, because I mean, Antwerp is months and months and months. I mean, you're talking about any of the channel ports. Under that plan, it might have made sense, but they still subscribe to it. So again, that inability to react in real time. Even though to give them, it was so unprecedented, so unexpected that the breakthrough would occur in that way. And who could have ever predicted Hitler's response?
Yeah, indeed.
In terms of I forget the code name, the German code name. Who could have anticipated that? That made no little sense. It certainly.
It's a completely written on the back of a cigarette packet plan. I mean, as people know, the German SS Armored Division commander said, "What the hell are we doing this for? It's pointless." They criticized it right at the outset. But just before we move on a little bit, we're talking. Patton is coming up in the sidebar about whether Patton, because he only really, I mean, it's still under debate is exactly what role he has, because he kind of gets Commander Third Army, but is there in this kind of weird advisory capacity for 3 or 4 days before. But he's still, in a sense, on probation from Sicily. He's still kind of working his way back in. And you see as the year goes out, by October, November, good old Georgie, or bad old Georgie, depending on your point of view, is coming really back into where he doesn't give a shit and does what he wants. But I would argue, and people are saying it, that in early August, he's still kind of
very, very much. I agree completely. He's just thankful to be in command of Third Army, to have that opportunity. And when you read his his diary, he just assumed he was going to be out of it, and he was on thin ice.
Yeah.
So looking at it from that perspective, you can empathize a little bit maybe with his position and unwillingness to really buck it. But you think about what he had going on though at the time with the breakout, and again without knowing how this is going to develop. So he has 8th Corps, so he's got this whole mission on how he's got to try to deal with the assignment in Brittany. But very soon thereafter, well, then he's got 12 Corps activated, which is just coming up in a couple of days here on the timeline. So he's got 12 Corps pushing east with a completely open right flank. And we were talking before the start of the show, talking about the coordination with Whalen's 19th Air Force, incredible 19th TAC, using really, again, pretty novel at the time, using almost exclusively air power to screen the entire south flank of the advance. So that's dividing. And then remember, Patton also had responsibility for the south side of the Falaise Argenton Gap. He had 15 Corps and 20 Corps. So he had 3 distinctly different theaters almost going on, 3 different missions at the same time.
And then, as you said there, the Germans then do their own counterattack in the middle of this, kind of going the same route in the opposite direction in places, which through the whole concept discussion of ultra has come up in the sidebar. Of course, at a high level, the Allies are aware of what the Germans' movements are kind of in real time, but that isn't always filtering down at that same speed to the reconnaissance elements of the units that we're talking about, like 4th Armored. But yes, it's far more complicated than people give it credit for, which I think is why a lot of people kind of end Cobra at getting to Avranches. Oh, we got to Avranches, and then they kind of just skip a few chapters and start off in the Ardennes, because it does get a bit muddy now.
But there is again, and I'd be remiss too if I didn't recommend to all listeners Martin Blumenson's work, Breakout and Pursuit, which is and I was blessed. Martin, before he passed away a few years before my book came out, and he wrote the foreword for my book, my first volume. So tremendous, and he does a great job of pulling all these elements together, which are not easy as an author and a researcher because of the disjointed nature of it. But
it's not easy.
Does a great job of that. Oops, I got a little heavy-handed. All right, so here from after Nantes becomes over a period of 12 days becomes a extremely swift. Even though some might say, well, 12 days doesn't sound super swift, but you're talking about a ton of miles being covered. And there are 2 particular engagements that are noteworthy for the 4th, and they both involved Combat Command A, which was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel or Colonel rather Bruce Clark, who became famous later. Bruce Clark is probably more well known for his command as a Brigadier General of Combat Command B at St. Vith in the Bulge, but Bruce Clark was 4th Armored from day one. And by the way, he went to the 7th because it was for the promotion. The 7th Armored also needed some better leadership. They were struggling a bit, but it was so he could get his star primarily. That's why he went from the 4th to the 7th. But Clark was in command at this point, and he, like General Wood, would get into a Piper Cub observation plane and do a lot of his command from the air. So Wood and Clark were very similar in that, in terms of command and control, which again I think was not a typical approach. But Clark led Combat Command A, and when they get to Orleans, this was the first significant resistance that they ran into, and there was an airfield right outside, just to the northwest of that town, where they overran some pretty considerable elements there. So they took Orleans, kind of regrouped after that. Again, supply considerations were a lot, because they can only go so far with what they've got in the tank. And you'll have to let some of the logistics catch up with them. But it was at Troyes on the 24th and 25th where it was just a classic engagement. And in this case, the elements of the Fourth, primarily elements of the 10th Armored Infantry Battalion and the 35th Tank Battalion, they were attacking in Troyes a superior force, not in armor, mind you, but a force stronger in infantry strength, certainly. And the one day I hope to visit the area. I've not been there personally. I would love to get there to see the battlefield. But there are heights to the west of Troyes and a very wide, very lengthy miles of open field.
I mean, that just came up while you're talking there, Don. I mean, and I've just checked the distance. I mean, we're talking 320 miles on a modern road from Nantes to Troyes, is how you say it. And I think we should acknowledge what Trent said in the sidebar. There is the push from Nantes to Troyes shows the great advantage, the reliability of the M4 Sherman and the organization of U.S. Army truck logistics, because without starting to kind of diss the Germans, although they do deserve it, they did start the war. But this is the kind of thing the Germans are struggling to do. You know, yes, we can absolutely question the whole veracity and sense of doing the Operation Luttich plan, but the Germans are struggling to even go a quarter of that distance without mechanical failures. Their divisions
right.
are full of, you know, a third of their armored vehicles are broken down. Then there's the fuel issue as well. There's no experienced crews. They haven't got the trucks. They haven't got the repair facilities. And this is that ability the US has, and the British and Canadians to a slightly lesser extent, but pretty much in the same area, to just move shitloads of stuff. Yeah. And all the support and all the logistics without even worrying about it. And if something breaks down, you fix it or replace it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm always in the camp that says the Sherman was the best tank during the war, mostly for all those reasons. And recognizing that the frequency of tank versus tank combat was minimal.
Yeah. Yeah.
In reality, it's, as Wood used to say, the tank is primarily a platform for machine guns. It's to get into the enemy rear and primarily use 30 cal, 50 cal to wreak havoc. That was more what he viewed a tank as being for. Yep. All right. So after Troyes, you've got two major water obstacles after that, and then you can see how divergent the path of the Fourth comes. And some of these arrows represent some recon elements, especially for Combat Command B, again, which is in the red. But this is covering considerable miles, and you know there wasn't a lot of strong resistance at the Marne or the Meuse, but still they were contested at the crossing sites. You know, at the Marne, in fact, in the blue was the 37th Tank Battalion, and in a rainstorm, charged those bridges and crossed over them before they could be destroyed. Because even with the marvelous engineers and the rapidity with which American engineers could construct bridges, still gaining an intact bridge was super critical, because you could expand beyond it, secure a bridgehead, and allow for the rapid follow-up of other forces. If the bridge is blown, you've got to do a river crossing before you're putting in a bridge. And depending on the width and the depth of the river, you're talking about considerable effort and a delay in the advance. So it was of great credit to the Fourth that they were able to capture these crossings as they did and made that advance. So when they get to the Meuse, you know, this is the point in time where the logistics issue really comes home to roost, and they didn't have the gasoline to move forward at that point. And here's something that I want to be very curious to get your thoughts on, Paul, and certainly if we get comments from the audience. I've seen heated discussions about the whole supplies, if it was going to Market Garden or whatever. That I don't subscribe to a lot of that. Logistics were tight no matter what.
Yeah.
Okay. Even before that, they were tight. The Fourth Armor was outrunning its supplies. You know, and you think about 12 Corps, which had the 5th Infantry Division, the 35th Infantry Division, if I'm recalling correctly. I believe those were the two infantry divisions that were part of the Corps, the single armor division. And then what you see here is just the width of the 4th Armored in the Corps, which I believe, if you measure, I think it was like 60 miles from north to south. Incredibly dispersed. And people will then talk about this period and, the gas was cut off and it went other places. And my gosh, if that hadn't happened, we would have won the war. We'd be across the front. BS. There's no way that was happening. And because advance with what? With how much force? Even if you shifted the strategy and it was going to be that the entire Allied campaign was going to shift to a single thrust. Keep in mind, at this point, the 7th Army, the forces coming up from the south of France hadn't even come up yet. The 3rd Army and 7th hadn't even linked yet. Attack with what? You're going to move across the German border to the Rhine, supposedly over the Rhine, with such a weak amount of force that, especially when you consider how well, to the Germans' credit, they were able to coalesce and put together, not too far after this date, put together substantive forces from the German interior. Those still would have coalesced around that. The American forces would have been on such a limb if they had managed to advance that far, that I think the results would have been quite negative.
I mean, I think I'm with you, John, and we're back to that whole concept of where do you put it. And there's comments flying in. Walter saying, Bradley says Patton could have gone past Metz if given the assets, gasoline, etc. That is also from Kevin Hemel. There's Market Garden. There's the push up in Provence. There's all this stuff happening as well. There's still supplies going to Italy because we're still pushing up the peninsula there. There's still so much stuff happening. And once you get into a certain point of conjecture, surely any of these army commanders, if they had got more supplies, could have done more with it. But then you're taking it away from another commander who would have been doing with it. It's hard to speculate what really would have happened, and we're into that whole kind of basic narrow front, broad front strategy. But it's hard, is what James Holland always says. Is the Allies are struggling with big war. They have the restrictions of wealth, that they have got a lot of staff, a lot of commanders, a lot of units, and they've got to spread their resources around through these. And the Germans have got a similar, but at the same time opposite problem, that their front is reducing. That they've got their camp group things they can kind of improvise, but they've got the kind of freedom of poverty that they just got nothing to play with at all. And the Allies have now got used to deploying lots of stuff, and they're not going to change now from having massive great army groups. If you've done things like totalize and tractable in Normandy with innumerable artillery troops supporting that, you're not going to now go, okay, well, let's just send a couple of divisions across a river and plow them on 100 miles without armor, without artillery and all the air power you need. We're not going to go backwards. It's like a ratchet to me. We're learning how to do stuff with steel. We're not going to go backwards, even if it might get us immediate short-term kind of on the ground gain. Does that make sense, Don?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yep. And by the way, I would agree with the person making the comment about, as far as advancing past Metz, whether they would have captured Metz, whether the Germans would have left that defenseless, I don't know. but clearly 12 Corps would have crossed the Moselle. I think there's little doubt about that. They would have moved beyond Annecy and so on. But I don't think they would have materially advanced past the West Wall. How would it have fundamentally made a difference? It would have made what became the November campaign. I want to say easier. They would have covered that ground, but still, any attack through the West Wall, if the timing had worked out, that it was then that if in mid-November they were already brought forward enough force to be at the West Wall, that would have probably turned out to be a much more deadly campaign.
Yeah.
At that point, than it ultimately turned out to be in that region. Once the Germans had exhausted themselves in the Bulge.
Wherever the advance goes, it's still going to be a shitty winter in terms of weather as well. That's going to be have an impact wherever you are. And I think it's coming up in the sidebar. The 2 years effectively the Allies had to plan Operation Overlord. And as you said, that they have these kind of randomly thrown on a map phase lines that I think they just had to put there kind of evenly spaced out. But I don't think anybody really thought that was a realistic or accurate assessment of what was going to happen. But yeah, the situation is changing very rapidly. From Normandy to the end of the war is 11 months. This information is coming into the Allies in real time through Ultra. The Germans are changing their defensive strategy day by day, and they're also basing that what's happening in the East post Bagration as well. So, and it keeps coming up in the sidebar that these Allied commanders, a lot of them on their first rodeo or their second. Very few have been doing this in the role they've been doing with the size of force they've had for 3 or 4 years. There's very few commanders with that. So they've all been moving up the ranks, getting bigger and bigger commands and more. So it's a massive, great learning curve. This whole liberating of Europe.
Yeah. So when we look back at it, when you go back to the start of Operation Cobra, so let's use from August or July 25th to September 1. And you look back at the sum total of what was done in about 36 days' time, and the amount of ground covered, the amount of cities liberated, the damage done to the enemy during that time, just looking at 12 Corps, 4th Armored Division in particular, it really is quite remarkable. And I'd be hard pressed to, unless we looked back to looked forward to the Gulf War and some of the advances into Iraq during the First World Gulf War. I'd have to check the distances there and calibrate against that. But I don't think there's ever been an armored exploitation of the sort that the 4th Armored achieved during that period of time. Certainly none within the American ranks during the war. There was no comparison with what any of the other armored divisions did. I'll never claim to be the best student of the Soviet, the Eastern Front, but I don't know within a similar amount of time if there's anything comparable or not. Now I'm curious.
I don't think so. I mean, as you know, we had the show with Steve Zaloga in our Bagration series. I mean, there's no concentration of German or Soviet armor anywhere along the entire Eastern Front that gets to a quarter of what the concentration of armor was, for example, in the Caen area or this American breakthrough in Cobra. So they just haven't got the armored vehicles. And as you're making the point, it's not like these American advances are down a single road, liberating single villages. At one point, you said there's sort of 60-mile front and that's just one armored division. So, and I want to make a point as well that Normandy hasn't even been completely liberated yet, not until the seizing of Le Havre on September the 12th. So we're still fighting in Normandy after 77 days, only takes up the Battle of the Falaise Gap. We're into 80 plus days and we've not taken Normandy. And yet, in these few days you've covered, the amount of this part of France has been taken is enormous.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable.
But yeah, so we're coming to the point where we're going to sum things up with. We've got a few questions. So
sure.
That's your books. So folks, I made the announcement at the beginning, but Don's website is in the description below. There's a fantastic Facebook group page he maintains as well, but you can find more information there. But it's all in the links below. But do you have any more summing up to do, or are we going to go to questions?
No, let's move on to the questions.
Okay, so some of them are comments and questions. We had it earlier about you talked about it yourself. There's the Operation Dragoon is happening. So when are some people like Wood is moving the 4th Armor? Is he aware that Dragoon is happening? Is he aware that 400 miles to his sort of southeast slightly there is this invasion? At what point had they been told there would be a link up, and where was that link up expected to happen?
Yeah, generally speaking, I mean, he's obviously aware of the invasion. He's aware of generally the movement of forces up the Rhone Valley. But the sort of the focal point, very loosely, was Strasbourg.
Right. Yeah.
And there were periods of time. It was interesting. The book that I have coming out in October is a collaboration with a veteran of the 53rd.
There it is on the right there. Yeah.
Paul Porter. It was interesting in his memoir. He, from his perspective, just as an enlisted man, they were always talking about Strasbourg being their destination. That was never a formal objective. Strasbourg was well to the south of the axis of advance, but that was sort of the point of reference, generally speaking, for where I'm just saying directionally how those army groups were going to come together. And there was just a lot of patrolling. So a lot of the back on that map where I showed all those red arrows moving south, a lot of that was to get the feelers out to finally make some contact. I do not recall the units that made the exact link up and contact between the armies, but it wasn't like two solid masses coming together. It was it was tentacles, very tenuous tentacles from the respective armies coming together. And remembering that you still had behind you in Vichy, France, still German forces, but most had holed up in the ports. But there were still elements trying to make their way back. I mean, always the German division that I think always gets the most credit for the most orderly retreat was the 11th Panzer Division, which had fought in the south of France. And they were a frequent opponent of the 4th Armored once they got to the Lorraine area, and a high level of mutual respect, by the way, between the veterans of those two divisions. Never any respect for SS, but the men of the 4th, when they were fighting a good, worthy opponent, that professional soldiers, the way they looked at it, doing what they had to do, it was refreshing for me to hear them talk about it, in terms of the level of respect they had. So 11th Panzer, maybe, I know a lot of, I think a lot of people, putting aside SS, a lot of people talk about the 2nd Panzer Division maybe as being the best, but I would state perhaps the 11th was the best that the Wehrmacht had.
Yeah. No. Okay. Well, we'll do some more questions. So, from our Filipino friend, Tonet is saying, was Wood still enjoying the full confidence of his commanders, or were the seeds of his relief already sown at this time? So in a kind of late August period, how's his reputation going?
At that point, he's already having a bit of a problem with certainly if you look at with some of Bradley's sentiment. He hadn't run into serious issues with Eddie yet, and it was with Mantonetti where he came to command 12 Corps. That ended up being the big rub. Now, I would say probably still, though, I'm pretty good footing at that point. Eddie wasn't there when Wood had his digression out in Brittany.
Right. Okay.
That was, but certainly that one must assume that transgression was relayed to Eddie when he took command. I'm certainly when he got briefed. A bit of irony, and we're getting ahead. It goes ahead into the history a little bit. Was that Wood and Patton were great friends.
Yeah, that came up in the sidebar.
Yeah, and Patton probably looked as though he was doing Wood a certain favor, but I mean, to give him his due, I mean, it's kind of tough. The reality was, in the end, Wood was subordinate to Eddie, and put Patton in a tough spot too.
And it's one of those things. It could be convenient to be friends with either Patton or Bradley. It was better if you could to try and stay friends with everybody. You are more likely to survive the cull by being a good old all-rounder, beholding to nobody, because having someone like that on your side can work well when they're in favor, and then when they're out of favor, you get brought down with them. So it's interesting. But a couple more questions. So technical stuff about tanks. Was the 76mm Sherman being phased into units at this point, and how much impact did they have in the fighting, or is it still 75s within the 4th we're talking about, obviously?
Almost virtually entirely 75s. My only awareness of some 76s coming into play was maybe shortly after this. So there were 76s when they were across the Moselle, still predominantly 75s. The 76s didn't get their meaningful numbers until then, as they were moving into the November campaign. So as they got into that, October was primarily their rest and refitting period. For the tank battalions, the armored infantry battalions still spent some time on the line. And then, of course, the A3E8s didn't come into play until right at the tail end of the Battle of the Bulge. They got their first A3E8s, the Easy 8s at that point.
Yeah. This is a potential rabbit hole that we may be discussing later on in the month when we talk about the First Allied Airborne Army. But Trent is saying if the Allies had planned better, they could have dropped airborne operations on forward air bases for airlifting fuel. The issue was the Allies simply didn't foresee that as a possibility. Well, that's into that whole, we've got airborne forces in August. What the hell are we going to do with them? Because all the operations that got cancelled, the ground overrunning where they're going to be. But this is a really good kind of Monday morning quarterbacking about what you could have done with airborne forces. There probably wasn't enough anticipation, as you said there, about which cities they're going to be moving to at what point and what the fuel situation would be to kind of anticipate these things, because you can't just bring in airborne with 24 hours. You need a week or two to get it ready. But any kind of reaction to that off the top of your head?
Yeah, I think, sounds great in theory, but I think for all practical purposes, and look, just like so much of war is about logistics, just about more than anything else. And I mean, think about the Red Ball Express as that's rolling to try to keep up with it, and moving petrol. Think about all the petrol you're burning just to get the petrol that you're trying to get to the front. I mean, it's
well, our World War II TV audience will now know for all the brilliance of the Red Ball Express, and it did do wonders to help break down the history of segregation and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, the railways that the Allies are bringing over were far more effective in bringing supplies forward than Red Ball Express, because, as you said, they're burning 2 gallons to deliver 3, or whatever the ratio is. Someone will correct me on that, but it's inventive. But as you said earlier, at this point, there's still not enough supplies to do everything you want to do to the level you could do it. It's always a compromise between, well, if we put it there, that's going to mean less there. But Trent also wants to ask you about the signals side. That's his big interest there, because we talked about the relative ease with which they could move these armored divisions across hundreds of miles with all the artillery, with all the support. But communications is vital, and we've talked a lot about the Soviet still struggling to deal with communications in their combined arms. 4th Armored Division, in terms of radios and communication, is it pretty streamlined by August 44?
Yeah, I think it's working very well, and it's not, I'll confess, not one of my strengths in terms of expertise, but based on the reading I've done, I never got any sense that there were challenges with communication. Some of that too may have been a function of the way they used their observation aircraft too,
right? Yeah.
For command and control purposes. But no, I always got the sense that communication was pretty solid.
It's one of those things, if you haven't read about it, it's probably because it's working quite well. The things that weren't working were the things that were being discussed all the time. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of attitude, I think, going on.
Yes. Yep.
Rainier, your mutual friend over is saying, Don, have you had a call from Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg? The story of the 4th Armored Division should become a miniseries, don't you think? Well, obviously your answer is going to be yes.
Yes, yeah. No, it always surprised me. Well, part of the motivation for my writing the unit history was that I was amazed that nobody else had. Other than the typical immediate post-war publication that the division itself put out, no one had done it. And you think about all the attention that, rightly so, that units like the 101st, I could write a long list of units that had gotten plenty of attention and histories on. So I always thought it was a big hole there. And I could write about it, and I probably will for the rest of my life. And just focusing on the one division, there are so many stories. There's one of the hardest things about writing my first two books on the fourth combined over 800 pages is trying to decide what stays in and what doesn't make it into it. I could write 5,000 pages. So there's countless material. This latest book coming out, Paul Porter's memoir, is just an example, and reading his words. He passed away in the 1980s. He wrote his combat memoir in the during the 60s, and it is. I'm going to say, not just because I'm involved in the project, it is spectacular. If you want a view of what it's like for somebody that's fighting eyeball to eyeball, hand to hand combat, combined with quite a outsized personality, boy, there's nothing like it. I've read tons of memoirs and published and unpublished as part of my research. I had never read anything like this, and committed to helping the family get it published. So I think when people read that alone should be made into a movie if somebody's good enough to pick that up.
And it sounds like one of those seminal accounts, along with the Eugene Sledges and the Don Burgetts and the Sidney Jarrys and the British Army and the George MacDonald Fraser. That, because actually we've said it quite a lot on this channel. Despite the sheer volume of veterans' memoirs from the war, a lot of them are okay, but they're not really fantastic. They're the number of absolutely exceptional, my God, the hairs stand up on your back of the neck, you understand the combat. It's not that many. And when you find one, you feel like you've discovered gold, don't you?
Yes. Yeah. And this is I'm confident this is going to fall in the category. It's interesting when his memoir started the day he arrived in France, and then it ended. So July 11th, I think, was his day on the continent, and then he was wounded. And on the day he won his Distinguished Service Cross, was on December 4th in the town of Domfessel in the Lorraine area. Unbelievably story, but that's where it started and ended. So with no context about the rest of his life in any way. Sometimes on the opposite side of that, one of the disappointing things with some memoirs is you get it hoping for a very rich tale of their experience in the war, and then you get a lot of other stuff, which obviously important to them in their life, but that's not the material reason you're drawn to it.
I'm in that process now. I'm buying every 79th, 90th Division and memoir I can, and some of them you get, okay, there's one paragraph out of that I can actually use, and other times you go, oh, half the book is fantastic, but it's that kind of gamble of never really quite knowing what's going to be there. But all, of course, offering their place to understand, but some are better than others. But we have a question from Dr. Philip Blood, is saying, how good were the division's armored recce units? Because I was reading something on Twitter or Facebook today about when we talk about reconnaissance, we're always talking about aerial reconnaissance. And yes, the Allies took hundreds of thousands of aerial photos, but on the ground reconnaissance is vital. And the role in the British of the reconnaissance regiment and the armored cars and Humber armored cars and scout cars, and the same in I think it's underrated. So how good were the 4th in this?
Yeah, the 25th Armored Cav Recon Squadron was outstanding, and they were always out front, and particularly on the flanks, and especially later when they were advancing across Germany. And my second book is from post-Bulge on, and that was fascinating to me. And as I were studying all the battalion records, and you look at where they were screening, because the 4th was so far out in front after they crossed the Rhine in particular, but you're depending upon all of these recon elements that are out there screening and out in front too. There were occasions where the main element of a task force might be the medium tanks of one of the tank companies out front, but more often than not, no, it's the recon units have already been moving beyond that point. Sometimes securing bridges and crossings in advance. They're the ones seizing it, and it's amazing work that they would do just primarily with those M8 armored cars and their peeps. And you had the one troop that was light tanks, But one of my favorite stories, talking about the resiliency too, and the capacity that the recon elements had. There was Troop C, was commanded after the Moselle crossing by Captain Charles Trover. And when the fourth, when the crossings above Nancy to the north, where the 80th Infantry Division operated, the first elements across were his troop. It was his troop, and then the 80th elements of the 80th had been counterattacked quite strong by German forces, and were having a bit of a tough time when those recon elements, when Trover's troop moved through, they engaged, to beat that back, and were successful until they ran into some Stug 3s. And he famously radioed back, "This I can't handle." and at that point, it was then with the main elements of the 37 Tank Battalion, then we're coming, to dispatch with that problem.
I remember speaking to British recce veterans, and they said if we had to fire the 37mm gun on the Humber armored car, we'd kind of gone too far and got into trouble. It was the gearbox getting you out of the act. That was your best weapon, is getting in there, getting out the information you want, and then getting the hell out of there before you get shot at, because there's always a bigger gun. That's the problem if you're a recce.
But you think about most of the elements they would come up when they're coming across soft targets, infantry, that 37 firing some shot canister is going to do a pretty good job.
Yeah.
Well, instance.
We will end things there, Don. It's been great talking to you. I think you should come back on December and do something about your new book and Paul's account. This sounds like a doozy to talk about, perhaps then or sometime before then. In the meantime, folks, I encourage you to go to the website, look into buying the new book and the existing books, and check out the Facebook page and do all that, folks. I'm back again tomorrow with Robert Kershaw talking about Crete. That'll be quite cool. And in the meantime, thank you for all your questions. We didn't get to all of them. We got to quite a few of them. And thank you to all the people who answer the questions in the sidebar there, because you don't even need me and Don to do them. You answer them yourselves. There's so much expertise. I'm very proud of you. So brilliant. So thanks, Don. Thanks, viewers. I'll see you all tomorrow. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Cheers. Bye.